James was considered much more sympathetic to Catholics than Elizabeth had been. So you'll remember that the Puritans had already been complaining for a long time before Elizabeth's death that she wasn't sort of Protestant enough, that the Church of England needed to move further away from Catholicism. But as soon as James ascended the throne, they started very quickly talking about Elizabethan England as a kind of golden age because James was so much more sympathetic to Catholics. His wife was Catholic, and he was less agreeable to the Puritans that tried to influence him and advise him in particular matters. That said, there's one particular event in James's reign, early on in his reign, that did sort of endear him to Protestants. It was the Gunpowder Plot of 1605.
Remember, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder, treason, and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.
The Gunpowder Plot was another Catholic conspiracy to overthrow the English government. What differed with this one was that it involved several people in London who were gathering barrels of gunpowder to store underneath Parliament. And the idea was that when King James came to Parliament, they were going to blow it up and basically kill all of the government officials for the national government in London, and that was how they were going to overthrow the government. It didn't work, in part because they had so many people involved that somebody let something slip or somebody snitched or whatever, and they got caught before they were able to go through with it. Also, they hadn't stored the gunpowder very well, so it was probably too damp to really be effective anyways. But this, kind of like the Spanish Armada in 1588, served as yet another example, sort of propaganda-wise, for the sort of righteous and rightness of Protestant England. The idea that God was on the side of the English Protestants and, was orchestrating things to foil yet another Catholic plot. And then in 1606, there was a law passed that basically restricted players, when performing plays, from speaking obscenities or sort of using the Lord's name in vain kind of thing. So the idea was that sort of mild oaths like sblood, which is short for God's blood, or zoons, which is short for God's wounds, that those sort of things were now outlawed, that they couldn't be part of the dialogue performed on stage. And then also any sort of mention of God or Christ directly had to be changed as well. And so you start getting a lot more references to like providence or the heavens or something like that, rather than specific mentions of God in plays. And then in 1611, we have a really important religious moment in terms of the King James Bible, the KJV, King James Version of the Bible, the Authorized Bible, being completed. 47 scholars working together over 7 years produced this. One of the things that's sort of remarkable about that, it's remarkable that they were able to agree on anything ultimately, but they did actually end up following a lot of the same translations from the Great Bible, which was the sort of earlier kind of authorized version, the earlier Bible in English available at most parish churches. So they actually didn't change very much about the translation itself. One thing that it did do was it created a far less anti-Catholic Bible than the Geneva Bible, which had been the most popular one in English parish churches for several decades at this point. And the Geneva Bible it's a translation of the Bible in English that's filled with marginal glosses. There are notes printed in the margins of pretty much every page, sort of commenting on the text on that page from the Bible. And the vast majority of those glosses are sort of very strongly Protestant, anti-Catholic, so that you would have a gloss for the whore of Babylon that gets mentioned in the book of Revelation, and the gloss would specifically note, that this is referring to the false church, the Catholic Church, that sort of thing. James was more sympathetic to Catholics than Elizabeth had been, and wanted a less anti-Catholic Bible to be the official Bible, the authorized one used throughout England in all of the parishes in the Church of England. And so that's how the KJV sort of came into being. The Geneva Bible remained sort of the main Bible around most of the country for a long time afterward, because that's what everybody already had. But there was a large effort to sort of get the authorized version out there, and to have parish churches, purchasing a copy and all of that sort of thing. James died in 1625, and his younger son, Charles, ascended the throne in 1625. So a quick bit of background for this. James's firstborn son, Henry, was supposed to be the next in line for the throne. And Henry, he gained this sort of reputation as somebody who was planning to be more militaristic and interventionist than his father was. So that as a teenager, Henry seemed that he wanted to take a much more aggressive action in terms of helping out Protestant forces on the continent that were, fighting in like the 30 Years' War. And this was not James's position at all. His motto was "Blessed are the peacemakers." He wanted to bring everybody together under this sort of reunified Christendom. But Henry was very much more of a kind of hardline, hot Protestant, not quite to the extent we might imagine a Puritan to be, but certainly somebody who the faction at court who wanted more military intervention, who was more strongly, radically Protestant, were very much in support of Henry and excited for him to take the throne whenever he would end up doing so. But then Henry died before his father did. And so when James dies in 1625, it's the younger son, Charles, who takes the throne. And Charles had not been groomed to be king. His older brother had been. And Charles was even more sort of sympathetic to Catholics than his father had been. His mother was a Catholic. He ended up marrying a Catholic. So eventually this leads to the English Civil War. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about the Civil War in terms of battles and years and anything to that extent. But I do want to focus a little bit here on, sort of the outcome of these religious tensions. So Charles dissolves Parliament in 1640, only a few weeks after a new Parliament had been summoned. He was trying to get them to help finance military campaign dealing with the Scottish, and they wanted to sort of curtail the king's power. They wanted to make Parliament more central to the runnings of the English government than it had been. And Charles didn't like that, and so he got rid of them, sent them all home. But then after a few months, he needed them to sort of come back and, do some stuff for him so that the government could run. And so he summons what came to be known as the Long Parliament. And the reason they are the Long Parliament instead of the Short Parliament that he had dismissed is because as soon as he summons them, shortly after, they start passing laws and new edicts that basically make it harder for the king to dissolve them. They make it so that the parliament has to meet at least once every 3 years, whether the king likes it or not. And eventually, they end up passing restrictions on the king's ability to dissolve them at all. And then in 1642, the Puritans now, the sort of radical Protestants, finally achieve what they'd been trying to do since the 1580s in closing the theaters. But instead of appealing to sort of English culture, writing treatises to try to turn people away from the theaters, convincing them that it was a corrupt and unholy thing to do, there was enough of them controlling Parliament that they simply passed an act that closed all the theaters in London, and all of them were torn down within the following year or two after that. And then skipping ahead a little bit, avoiding any mention of some military campaigns and such, by 1649, there were enough sort of radical Protestant, hot Protestant Puritans in power in Parliament, and they had been at war with the King of England and his supporters for long enough that they ended up arresting him and trying him for treason. And they decided that he was guilty and had him executed. The only time an English monarch has ever been executed by an act of Parliament. And so by now it's, sort of thoroughly, completely under the control of the sort of extreme Protestant side. The Puritans are the ones in power. They go on to form this sort of interregnum government, or what we now think of as the interregnum government, a commonwealth, with Oliver Cromwell at the head. But Cromwell basically ends up being a kind of elected dictator, doesn't operate all that differently from the way the monarch had before, and then he dies. They have to find somebody to replace him. His son tries to, but he can't really make it work. And so by 1660, 11 years after the execution of Charles I, Charles II, King Charles I's son, is restored as the monarch. And Parliament decides to restore the monarchy completely, and Charles is welcomed back into London. And the Puritan faction that had orchestrated the execution of his father, basically any of them that are surviving and that haven't fled the country are executed pretty quickly after that. So at this point, the monarchy wins, the Puritans lose, and then we get Restoration drama because the theaters are reopened, and King Charles II decides that women should be allowed to perform in plays just like men. And so we start getting Restoration plays that include women playing women's roles, and plays that just end up being very different from what had come a few decades earlier before the theater ban had been put in place in 1642.